Шановні колеги,
Dear colleagues, the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center continues its operation, and now we are going to speak about why self-organization of citizens may be the first step to decentralization. Welcome our speakers. Good afternoon, dear friends. My name is Olexiy Orlov. I'm the Program Initiatives Director on Democratic Practice at the International Renaissance Foundation. I'm candidate of legal sciences, and I'd like to talk today about self-organization within the meaning that it is currently envisaged by our Ukrainian legislation. Lots has been heard and said today about the decentralization reform and local self-government reform. But as a rule, the ideologies behind these reforms, those experts and officials speak about just one aspect of it, which covers a redistribution of certain responsibilities between various bodies of local self-government and establishment of new authorities and bodies within the scope of local self-government. They also mention establishment of new administrative and territorial units, etc., frequently overlooking the fact that, as of today, local self-government is not about activities and operations of individual bodies and officers or officials, but also, as it is said in the Constitution of Ukraine and European Charter for Self-Government, it is also the form of local democracy. We can speak about local democracy forms used regularly, like elections or referenda, but unfortunately, these rather known forms also are not free of their own problems. We know that there is no new legislation of local elections or local referenda. And at the same time, we see quite a bunch of forms that may, can, and should be used by local community members at their place of residence on a regular daily basis, even in between elections. It is about general meetings, public debates and discussions, local initiatives, operations and activities of bodies of community self-organization, etc. That is, we have a really long list of such forms mentioned in the legislation. Another question is whether local communities are well able to use these forms. In many cases, the answer will be no, because either it is about the absence of the specific legislation to regulate those issues, say about general meetings of community members, or we can see pieces of legislation really cumbersome enough and failing to provide proper enjoyment of these democracy forms. A third option can be insufficient regulation of these democracy forms at the level of statutes of local communities. Unfortunately, only around 17% of local communities have statutes of their own. This means that it is not possible to use these local forms of democracy in around 86% of communities. And even in those that do have these statutes, the level of enjoyment of democracy forms is at its lowest. And we can say that from the professional standpoint, the deficiencies are abysmal. From here comes the question how it may be possible to secure involvement and participation of local community members in such forms of local democracy. Coming from these positions and the language of our constitution, a group of Ukrainian civic organizations chaired by the Association to Contribute for Self-Organization of the Local Population has engaged in the development of a range of laws and regulations to regulate the matter at least partially at the national level. Two draft legislations from the announced package have been registered with the Parliament. There is a new version of the law on self-organization of the population. Registered number is 2460, and the one 24/7 on territorial communities at places of residence. The two bills hopefully will allow filling the gaps, existing gaps in the legislation, and my colleague will speak more on that. I would conclude by saying that today the use of local democracy forms, it's not about whims of individual experts, it is about the need for that, because the approval by the Parliament of the two mentioned bills will create really serious preconditions for a viable reform of administrative and territorial setup of Ukraine, because the laws on voluntary communities, local communities, and other pieces of legislation are not free of numerous problems, despite listing a variety of local democracy forms.
Dear colleagues, Kyryllova Tetiana, I'm on the head of the board of Ukrainian Association Improvement on Support and Self-Governance of the Population. I will not speak for long, but I will be ardent. I would like to emphasize on what I am going to discuss. So my main task today is to tell you that to support these laws, draft laws, the association was able to collect about 200 signatures from civic activists, from local self-governance bodies, and from civic NGOs from all the regions of Ukraine. And as you saw, they continue to bring signatures even now. During this press conference, I would like to show there's just several pages from those organizations that send them to us. At present, that's civic councils from Lugansk region, Mykolaiv, Kherson, Kiev, many regions. Why I'm telling you about this? Because, as you see, our draft laws that were initiated and brought to the parliament, they passed broad public discussion, and they're based on practice, and they were discussed from practical people, with those people who work directly in the field and know all the problems of local bodies of self-organizing and problems that they have with meetings, general meetings, issue legalization and setting up bodies of self-organization, financial issue, delegation of powers, and that's why the parliament, deputies in the parliament, they need to consider these draft laws. Otherwise, our phrase Donbass doesn't hear, and it will turn into the phrase the people don't hear. The reform should not go only from the top, it should come from the bottom. And then, otherwise, local village mayors will not be heard, and those communities that don't have the representative bodies, they will not be heard. Of course, issues of decentralization and administrative territorial reform are very important, and they are very popular. Of course, the parliament did a couple of important steps. They passed two laws about voluntary unification of or voluntary union of communities and cooperation units. These are two wheels of the car, which is called reforms and decentralization. Passing these laws about bodies of self-organization of people and the law on general meetings, those are two lacking wheels for that vehicle, and that will allow the reforms to come from the parliament and to go to regions, and from Facebook pages to regions also. These letters tomorrow we will give them. They addressed to the Speaker of the Parliament, to the President of Ukraine, to the Prime Minister, and also to the head of the Profile Committee of the Parliament of Ukraine on regional policy, local self-governance, Olexiy Vlasenko. Dear colleagues, is there a question? Denis Amin, Day newspaper. I have a question. Could you give a concrete example how that could work on the level of a community? Several examples. Maybe it works somewhere, and what's the situation abroad? How the similar example. Thank you very much for your question. At present, in Ukraine, there are bodies of self-organizing people, if we speak about that. Ukraine, those who have, we have 1,500 of self-organizing units, street committees, building committees, district committees, etc. How many bodies of self-organization of population that are set up in a legal way, but without without a legal entity, so not registered through informant? It's nobody will tell you that, because Ukraine doesn't have a register of certain structures, but according to our information, the number of such structures is higher than by 7-8 times the number of those structures that have their legal status. So we have about 10,000 self-organizing bodies. So these are concrete. This legislation must improve. Is meant to improve life of these structures for them to be able to create easier for them to have a material base for their functioning. The problem, again, if we speak about experience and the number of initiatives to set up bodies of self-organizing of organizational people, is probably 4 times more than the number of legalized bodies. Experience of Kiev and other cities proves that about 20, 25, maximum 30% of initiative groups bring the process according to this to a logic end. So to set up a body of self-organization of people, because at present it's very difficult to set up such a body. For example, to have a housing building committee or your district committee, you need to hold at least 2 times the general meeting of people who live there, for them to elect staff of the body of self-organization, so the chair, deputy, secretary, and member, and there should be a secret vote according to the same procedures like when we allow deputies president. You can imagine the level of decisions if we elect the president or the head of the multi-storied building. But it's very important that according to the constitution of Ukraine, all self-organization bodies, they are very specific. They belong to the system of local self-governance. They are representative bodies, and likewise local councils, like village councils. But they act on micro-territories, as we say, on the level of multi-storied building, street, quarter. So that's why the potential is quite big. The question is how to make that potential work and how to involve members of territorial communities. If to speak about foreign experience, in many countries of the world, for example in Poland, to which we refer when we speak about reform of local self-governance, they delegate powers to self-organizing bodies. They're called differently according to Polish legislation, but nevertheless, what does it mean? That they transfer even sometimes facilities of social infrastructure, libraries, clubs, for them to solve some minimal needs of that local community. In Warsaw, they counted economic effect from transferring such structures to local self-organization bodies. 30% of saving money from the budget. If to speak even from that position, potential in such forms of self-organization is very high.
A couple of specific examples, most characteristical in your view, for people to better grasp it. One of the real nice examples in my mind can be found in Vinnytsia. We hear a lot about this town, and in the context of self-organization, we seldom know exactly what's happening there. Meanwhile, they have 24 forms of local resident self-organization established solely within privately developed neighborhoods. Those that were used not to have proper water supply, sewage elimination systems, they had poor roads, no reliable electricity supply, etc. At some point in time, the town municipal administration approved regulations of procedure on co-funding, 50-50 co-funding, involving funds collected by local residents and money from the municipal budget. And in this procedure, they've managed to collect millions of hryvnias in the last year to drastically improve their own territory and its livelihood. They provided water supply, sewage systems were built, street lighting was improved, etc. And there are many more examples on that. Take cities like Kherson, where the municipal council approved provisions allowing local self-organization bodies to control the quality of utility services delivered, or say the quality of repair works done in communal owned buildings. And I may even give the floor to Tetiana. She's head of the self-organization body, and she may be better off to describe it. Actually, I can tell that same examples can be found also in Kyiv, in Lugansk, and many other towns and cities. Owing to relevant provisions developed, we are better able to solve our utility problems. At times, citizens had to go to courts to defend their interests, say regarding tariffs or lack of proper repairs, etc. And the examples mentioned are really bright in terms of showing what can be done regarding everyday utility needs and repair needs of local citizens. From my regular communications with other organization members, I do know that there are matters like, say, illegal development in residential areas, and again, civic society organizations are better able to fight off these cases. They can also tackle issues of low wage or vulnerable groups, like retired people or other. As I am from Lugansk myself, we have a lot of examples from Lugansk Oblast showing how local residents managed to set up their own volunteer organizations to help themselves, to help those who had to flee the city. They assisted in evacuating elderly people and young children from the area of conflict. And we may not say that self-organization is at its lowest at the moment. We should better speak of a variety of its forms and of deficiencies and gaps in the legislation that prevent these forms to develop further. And two things from my side. The two draft legislations I've mentioned, they have been signed and endorsed by 17 MPs representing all the major factions in the parliament, which gives us reason to believe that these will be adopted and finally enter in force. We spoke mostly of self-organization bodies, practically not mentioning general meetings of community members. Meanwhile, it's a very serious question how we as dwellers of, say, residential block may gather together to decide on our common problems. This issue is still regulated by a parliamentary resolution dating back to 95. And actually it requires certain permissions for such general meeting from local government to be sought. And this is a very demonstrative thing about the deficiencies that exist. Why we speak of the necessity to have general meetings? Because other forms of democracy should generally be based on these grassroots general meetings, seen as the first chain in the direct self-government. Any questions? If not, I have a question.
You say that there are some gaps that must cover those gaps. There are some legislation that can cover those gaps. So maybe it's not the issue of the law, maybe it's the problem with law activity or something. Something can be done today, and some of those moments are not regulated. Those bodies of local self-organization and active people who are working there, and they are quite successful. They work not because of the law, but despite of the law. So there are some. They make them to survive somehow and to prove something in the court. We learned the case law. We studied the case law, and there are a lot of questions how they are legalized. Lots of questions to ways of delegating. So the law is just a framework law, but procedures are not described. As I told you many times, there is a law, so it's like a remedy. People have a lot of disease, but they are treated differently. They have the same regulations of law are interpreted differently in different regions of Ukraine. It's like with medicine. So because of many years of experience with other regions, there was a necessity to bring it into a system, to make it systematic. The law of Ukraine that is in force, it has some corruption risks. In some regions, local organization bodies, they are set up from the top, the initiative of the local bodies of power, and it's like an appendix to executive committees, to some local councils, and then they do what they tell them. And there are veterans organizations, as you know. They put them on budget, and before elections they start some activities. So the law we have, it doesn't provide what is needed for full-fledged local committees. One more, it's clear that the issue of legal regulation is only a part of components that we need to solve. But if there is a real law, both that we mentioned, representatives of local governance and who don't have political will, and that's a very important element in the system of existing legal relations with the development local self-organization body. It will be more difficult for them to stand against local members, local community, if they want to realize different forms of direct people's power. I say all the time that there are at least three key positions that can provide development of any form of people's power. First of all, the legislation, but on the national level, what they approve, those should be framework norms. They should cover those situations when, on the local level, local self-governance bodies, if they don't have a political will, for example, and then one more component, political will. If they don't have political will, then to develop local self-governance will be very difficult. And also, if they don't have it, there will be a struggle or courts and process, and there will be contradiction. It's not work, but disputes and fights. And the third point, the ability of people to realize those direct forms of people's power. Unfortunately, we have a few of such examples, but we need to switch these forms from many cities, towns, and those who woke up after events of our revolution of dignity. It's very important that these forms of civic activity, if we turn them into civilized way, for them to work according to legislation and to be able to realize their rights on the local level. Any question?
Питання, скажіть, будь ласка, а чи не здається вам дивним?
Is it not a surprise for you that these two basic wheels, like decentralization you're talking about, that were missing? There could be basic level, and then maybe they should start with that, improving those laws. But decentralization has started, and the merger of communities takes place without documents. Why does it happen?
It will be obviously hard for me to give a response to that because I do not belong to those at power, have no right to vote in either the cabinet or the parliament. But I can tell you that these draft legislative acts were already registered in the parliament of previous convocation, though under different numbers. And in the majority of the language, they have remained untouched since then. It is really hard to say why the parliament did manage to endorse them previous time, but it may be very hard, challengingly hard to fly on one-winged aircraft of reform without these pieces of legislation adopted. Because these legislative acts will serve a guarantee of reforms being done from bottom to top, not from top to bottom. Or better said, from reciprocal directions. And speaking of reforms now, we think of ways of attracting people on real terms into the reform, and we want to have it in a legitimate way, so that it would be perceived by residents in a positive way and would not see any apprehension from the people. There are numerous cases registered today with people's lack of acceptance of what is being forced on them. Okay, thank you. With no more questions from the audience, I do hope that these bills will be adopted and people will be better off with fighting for their rights. Thank you. This is it for